Welcome back to Kris versus Everybody. I'm your host, Kris Canty. This is the podcast where I talk about anything and everything unedited, uncensored, unapologetic, no filters, no fluff, just real talk. This episode is brought to you by the Crisscross Studios YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, hit that follow button to stay up to date with every new episode as it drops. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your support. Now let's get into what happened last night on Truth Social. Trump posted a racist video depicting the Obamas, Barack and Michelle, as apes. He since then took it down. But we all know he put it up there for a reason. There are moments in a nation's life when we are forced to look in the mirror and ask ourselves a simple but uncomfortable question. Who are we? Not who we say we are, not who we pretend to be on holidays or during campaign speeches, but who we really are when the spotlight hits our character. And none of those moments comes whenever Black people are compared to apes and monkeys. Let's be clear from the very beginning. This is not a joke. It's not edgy humor. It's not political satire. It is one of the oldest, most deliberate forms of racist dehumanization in modern history. Calling Black people monkeys and or apes is not accidental language. It is historically engineered language. To understand why this is so offensive for people who are like, oh, why are they so mad about Black people being so... All right. Especially the press secretary, which I will get in her ass later in the episode. But right now we're going to talk about the historic stuff about calling people, specifically Black people, apes and monkeys. To understand why it's so offensive, you have to understand where it comes from. For centuries, racist pseudoscience attempted to rank human beings into hierarchies. Europeans were always conveniently at the top. Africans were placed closer to primates, literally argued to be less evolved, less intelligent, and less civilized. This wasn't just insults, it was justification. Justification for slavery, justification for colonization, justification for segregation, justification for violence. If you can convince a society that a group of people is somehow less than human, it becomes much easier to deny them rights, deny them dignity, and deny them empathy. Because people don't feel moral conflict when they mistreat something they've been taught is an animal. That's why this imagery carries so much weight. It's not just offensive, it is historically tied to systems that carried generational trauma. And there's something important many people miss about this whole thing. Intent does not erase impact. Someone might say, oh, you're being too sensitive. You're just being, it was just a joke. But sensitivity isn't the issue. History is the issue in this circumstance. Imagine telling the descendants of people who were enslaved, lynched, and legally segregated against that they are compared to primates and saying that it is harmless and you're too sensitive and you should just laugh it off. They're basically reopening wounds that have never closed. Now let's raise the stakes even higher, since this is my podcast. When rhetoric like this enters political spaces, especially from individuals in positions of enormous power like Donald Trump, the consequences multiply. Leadership is not just about policy, it's about tone. It signals what is acceptable in a society. Presidents, governors, senators, they don't just pass laws, they shape culture. When the most powerful voices model respect, societies tend to lean towards dignity and doing the right thing. When powerful voices normalize cruelty or post videos of presidents with a brown skin tones, apes and monkeys, societies become coarser, harsher, and more divided. History shows us this again and again. Language is never just language. It gives permission for jokes that aren't jokes, permission for harassment framed as humor, and permission for prejudice disguised as opinion. Racism is not a partisan issue. It is a moral issue. No matter your ideology, conservative, liberal, independent, we should all be able to agree that degrading people based on their race is beneath the character of a nation that claims liberty and justice for all. We can disagree on taxes. We can debate immigration. We can argue about foreign policy. But the humanity of people should never, ever be up for negotiation. And there's another truth we have to confront. America has made real progress. Yes, progress that previous generations could barely imagine. We have seen barriers fall. We have seen representation grow. We have seen doors open that were once nailed shut. But progress is not a straight line. It requires protection. It requires vigilance. And sometimes it requires calling things exactly what they are. Not to inflame, but to clarify, not to divide, but to set a standard. Because silence has never been the engine of justice. Now, some listeners might be thinking, why keep talking about race? Why don't we just move on? Just like the press secretary, the White House press secretary just said today. But we're not just going to move on. And here's why. Because you cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. Pretending something isn't racist doesn't make it less racist. It just makes accountability harder. And accountability is not about punishment. It is about growth. It is about saying we can do better than this, especially from those who aspire to lead. The presidency, any presidency, should represent the highest aspirations of the country, not perfection, but maturity, not cruelty, but responsibility. The office carries symbolic weight far beyond legislation, something that Donald Trump has still failed to realize in his second term. Like I said earlier, when leadership reflects empathy, it strengthens the nation's moral credibility. When leadership reflects mockery or dehumanization, it weakens the moral credibility. So where do we go from here? First, we must reject the normalization of dehumanizing language. Not when it's convenient. Always reject dehumanizing language. Second, we must demand higher standards from leadership. President, senators, representatives, mayors, teachers, lawyers, parents, counselors. You can condemn racism without being hateful. You can call out wrongdoing without abandoning dignity. In fact, that's exactly how progress is made. Third, we remember that patriotism is not blind loyalty. Real patriotism is believing your country is strong enough to confront its flaws and courageous enough to improve. Calling out racism is not anti-American, because every expansion of freedom in this country started with people refusing to accept injustice as just the way things are. And finally, we must resist the temptation to become numb to this stuff. The fact that I'm doing this podcast this late at night, because I have to talk about this. We're not going to become numb to this stuff. And I wouldn't be okay if some other person did it on Twitter and thought it was funny. I would have called them out too. But we're talking about the president of the United States. The person who said that I love Black people, I support Black people, that Black community is one of my favorite communities, he said, in Detroit. How do you come to Detroit, sit in front of a congregation at a Black church, plead for our vote in 2024, 2020, and 2016, and then put that video out on Truth Social? A healthy society never loses its ability to say no. Not every controversy deserves equal attention, but anything that questions the humanity of a group of people deserves serious reflection. So let this be the takeaway today. Comparing Black people to apes is not human. It is not politics. It is not harmless. It is a relic of a darker framework we should have outgrown so long ago. We should have outgrown this years, decades ago. And America is at its best when it chooses elevation over degradation, dignity over mockery, humanity over division. We don't have to be perfect, but we do have to be better, because the measure of a nation is not how loudly it celebrates freedom, it's how consistently it practices respect. And leadership at every level, especially the highest office in this nation, should reflect that truth. And that's been another edition of Kris versus Everybody. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. Like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Follow the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you have it. See you guys next time.